Hello, everybody. Can we all hear me? Just a thumbs
Yes,
up.
I hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Linda Lani. I am so excited to be back. Really, I think we haven't seen each other in about 2-3 months. So this is very exciting. Thank you so much for joining. I see there are some more people who are joining. So we're just going to wait 1 minute and then we are going to get down to business, which is great. I am very excited for today's Back to Basics. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
We can see it, Michelle.
Perfect. So for this month, for February, well, a little bit of March as well, because our dialogue is going to be on the 1st of March. But the theme for February is talking about energy. So really sort of looking at life after call, but we can't really have a discussion around life after COP27 and talk about energy if maybe we don't necessarily understand fully what energy looks like, or even have a basic idea of what that is about. And that's sort of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to get a very general idea of what the energy status in Africa looks like, so that when we do have our Back to Basics dialogue on Wednesday, we will all be able to follow the conversation as well as contribute to it. So I'm very excited, and thank you to everybody who's joined us. For today, we are going to very, I don't want to say quickly because it's not quickly running through them, but very briefly run through energy and the environment in the form of a crash course. So I'm very excited about that. But before we get straight into it, I just want to raise a flag and say that this session is literally a crash course, which means that all of the concepts that we're going to explore here, we can also explore them as full workshops on their own, right? So if we just look at the idea of energy, we can have multiple workshops. We can have so many workshops on their own. So please just do understand that. And I invite everybody who's here and everybody who's going to be listening to please do extensive research after the workshop or after listening to this session. So I had put this in the chat and I saw some people were starting to respond, which is amazing. Just doing a little bit of a check-in in the chat. So who are you and where are you joining from? If it's your first time joining our Back to Basics workshops, my name is Michelle and I normally host with co-hosts on a rotational basis. I am with the African Climate Alliance and I'm very excited for these sessions. And I am joining from Cape Town and I feel very energized, very excited as well. I know that's more than one word, but I feel very excited and energized to be here and to be running these workshops again after taking a little bit of a break. And then one thing that brought me joy this month, just being able to rest between work cycles, because I think sometimes we often forget that rest is important. So very excited. I am just going to remind everybody to please keep your microphones off. And then if you do have a contribution, to please put your hand up. That would be incredible. Or if you're not comfortable unmuting and doing a contribution, amazing if you could just pop your contribution in the chat. Great. I see people tuning in and telling us where they're from. That's very exciting. Right. And before we get into the crux of the matter, before we get into the meat of the cabbage, just a little bit of context, right? So last year around November, there was COP, which was hosted in Egypt. And COP is a conference of the parties that is hosted by the UNFCCC. I stand to be corrected. And it's sort of like the global conference for discussing issues around climate change, environmental issues, and even social justice to an extent. So at COP27, we saw that there were discussions that sort of intensified around this idea of like a just energy transition and the need for alternative energy sources to support the move away from fossil fuels toward a greener, cleaner, and more sustainable and just future. We did have a Back to Basics session. So if you missed that, you can go back to some of the recordings and just go through that Back to Basics sessions, as well as a dialogue talking about this idea of a just energy transition. So we're not going to go too much into depth about that today. So these conversations obviously sort of play this role of trying to paint this picture for us, this future where all of us have access to resources in a just and equitable way, including energy, right? Because energy is a resource. But getting to that future means that we have to take the steps to understand the impact of energy production, its usage on the environment, as well as Africa. And it means that we need to understand these ideas of energy use and what empowerment looks like, or capacitation in the African context, so that we can start these discussions as well as lead them, right? So we are going to understand the current state of energy in Africa, or maybe we're just going to scratch the surface today and just get a little bit of an understanding of what that looks like. And then we will have a discussion on what energy justice looks like, as well as the challenges faced by developing nations. And at the same time, we'll be exploring the potential solutions to ensure just energy transition in our ACA dialogues 2 days from now. So please tune in for the ACA dialogue as well on Wednesday evening, same time. But we'll give you more information about that toward the end. Cool. So just as we're about to get started, just a few more housekeeping things. Please raise your hand if you have a question or a contribution. Please practice the rule of 2. Fortunately for me, I'm exempt from this rule because I'm holding the space. But please practice the rule of 2. Allow 2 people to speak or contribute before you contribute again. We normally do an exercise on this, and I'm not sure if Sarah and Gabriel are ready to be tagged in just to demonstrate what the rule of 2 looks like.
I'm ready when you are, Michelle.
Awesome. Sarah, I did see you here. Are you ready?
Sure, no problem.
Perfect. So I'm just going to say something. It was a lovely sunny day today, but there was a little bit of wind. And then Gabriel?
And then I'll jump in because it's now my turn to speak. And then instead of Michelle speaking again, Sarah will speak, or someone else will speak. Sarah?
Yes, so now it's my turn, and I will say what I need to say, and then pass it back to Michelle before Gabriel or someone else.
Perfect. And so what you just saw is there were 2 people who spoke before I got the chance to speak again. Thank you so much to Gabriel and Sarah for being so willing. So that is the rule of 2. Please practice it. It's just to give other people an opportunity to contribute. And then feel free to use your home language. We'll try by all means to translate. And if we do have translators in the house, please help us out, especially in the chat. And then, just a small apology, or a big apology rather, that we are using English as the primary language of communication in the space. We are aware that it's not everybody's first language. It's not even my first language, but it seems to be easier to communicate in English. And we apologize for that. And then we are going to get straight into it, right? So the crash course for today is going to be exploring energy and the environment in Africa. We want to understand what energy looks like. We want to know what the environment looks like. In some ways, we even want to marry some of the things that we've learned in the past with what we're going to sort of learn and pick up from today's session. If you don't mind, I'm going to keep my video off for the most part and turn it on only when necessary. So we have some of the following energy sources in Africa. And this is sort of where we're going to start, right? So we've heard of fossil fuels. A lot of us may even be campaigning against fossil fuels and are in support for the phasing out of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels include oil, coal, and gas. Another energy source is hydropower. Another is wind power. Hydropower is power that is generated through water. We're not really going to get into the specifics of that. And then we've got wind power, we've got solar power, that is the power that we get from the sun. And then we have got geothermal energy. We'll speak a little bit about this, hopefully, as we progress. So now, when we're speaking about the side of energy and the environment in Africa, after understanding that we have all of these sources that are either in use currently, some which are in the process of people trying to phase them out, and others which we're trying to explore the potential of, like hydropower, solar power, wind power, we then start looking at energy demand as well, right? So research suggests that Africa has a lot of energy sources. Like we've seen, we know that at some point, or at least I know, that I've driven past an energy, a wind farm with these big wind turbines, right? And I've also started to see the rise of people installing solar panels so that they can harness the energy from the sun, instead of relying a lot on some of the power that we get from our governments. So I have seen some of that, right? So this is the rise of people looking to alternative energies, and it hasn't just started now, but I think it's getting a lot more popular. But this just goes to show the abundance of energy sources. However, one of the problems that we currently face in Africa specifically is that we have a low energy consumption compared to other regions in the world for many different reasons. One being that we have low levels of economic development. This also means that we have inadequate infrastructure, or we don't have strong enough infrastructure that can house or harness this energy that we have available to us. Even though we have an abundance of energy sources, the demand of energy at the moment is expected to grow in the coming years due to population growth as well as economic development. Africa is part of a region that is called the developing world. That means that a lot of aspects, so our education systems, our economies, our housing, our healthcare systems are still in the process of developing. And with that development means that we're going to have economic growth. So we're going to have more people who are able to contribute to our economy, be it formally or informally. And we're going to have more people who decide to have kids and that sort of thing, contributing to our population growing. So all of these are going to contribute to the need for energy being higher, because more people will need to use this energy, and more activities like economic activities will rely on energy being available. All right, which means that our energy demand is going to go high. Which brings us to a conversation around energy access, or this idea of energy access. Now we know that Africa is in its developing stage, or a lot of what is called the global south or the developing world is still developing. And we've spoken a little bit about infrastructure now, but at the moment we know that a lot of the African population still lacks access to modern energy services. So looking at electricity, we've got a lot of households that don't have access to electricity, but they have to rely on alternative energy sources. Some of them, for cooking needs instead of using an electric stove or even gas. Some of them are having to use firewood instead of having electricity powered lights. We have to use candles or paraffin lamps and that sort of thing. So there is a lot of lack of access to modern energy services like electricity and clean cooking facilities, which has very big implications for health, or very big issues or problems for health, education, and economic development, right? So you can imagine that if you don't have access to energy in whatever form, maybe electricity being one that is almost always most focused on, we know that that is going to affect my ability to maybe do my homework at home, maybe affect my ability to be able to access healthcare. And because maybe I'm not as educated, I might not be able to access economic development opportunities. It could be in the form of employment or whatever else would be related to that. So really this idea or this conversation around energy, or this issue around energy access or energy in general in Africa, poses a lot of different issues for us, because if we don't have access to energy, it means that we are disadvantaged. Like we just heard, in terms of clean cooking facilities, it means that if I don't have access to clean cooking facilities, I might get sick, which will affect my education, which will affect the ability that I will have to contribute to economic development. And this can take form in whatever way that it will present itself. I'm just giving a lot of examples. Just so this can sort of make a little bit more sense, so that we can paint more of a clearer picture, right? All right. So I feel this is important to mention, because a lot of the times when we're speaking about energy access, energy demand, we also start having this conversation around the just energy transition, right? But a lot of people also just focus on this idea of an energy transition. We know that, like, for instance, in South Africa, we rely a lot on coal to produce a lot of our electricity. With the move away from coal, because we know of the environmental harms that coal poses, not only to coal mining communities, but surrounding communities as well, we are urgently having to move away. Not to say we are urgently moving away, but there's a need for us to urgently move away from non-renewable energy sources, so that we can start relying on renewable energy sources. That's our wind power, that's our solar power, that's our hydropower, right? And this idea brings the concept of a just transition, or a just energy transition. A transition simply means you're moving from one point to another. And because we are wanting to move from economies and countries that are powered by non-renewables, we want to transition or move toward economies and countries that have renewable energy sources to rely on, right? So that move, that transition from point A to point B needs to be just. All right. And this idea of it being just is what we're going to explain here. So if it's going to be just, it means that that transition needs to create a society which is fair, which is equal, which is equitable. And a just society can only be born when we start to take away and pull apart the unjust systems that continue to disadvantage the majority of people. In our case, it's the majority of people in Africa, and subject them to harsh living conditions, or place them in, for example, food deserts, right? So this is just like an example of what a just society would look like. It would mean that if we all have access to energy, it means that we might all then be able to study better, because we have like reliable light and we can see, it's bright, and we can do our homework at night, right? Just very, very small examples that I'm using here. And so just to keep this in mind when we explore the conversation a little bit further around what means and why it means that, this concept of a just energy transition. All right. Now we've spoken a little bit about energy. We've looked at energy demand. We've looked at energy access. We've looked at energy sources. How can we then marry these like energy and environmental challenges? How are they related? Where's the link? That's sort of what we want to find out, right? At the moment, we know that Africa suffers from some of the following environmental challenges: deforestation, the act of cutting down trees, desertification, the act of places becoming deserts, or because of extreme droughts, a place will become like a desert because it doesn't have water anymore. Soil degradation. So if we keep reusing soil and not really taking care of it, we know that it's going to lose like quality. It might even get to a point where it's toxic. So we can't really plant things in that soil. Water pollution is one of the environmental challenges. This takes form in a lot of different ways. We've seen people dump literal waste in our riverbanks, our seas, our dams, which is absolutely terrible. People have gone to the extent of dumping oil and plastics in our water, which is obviously very, very challenging and very, very bad for our health. So water pollution as well as air pollution. The conversation around air pollution, we can think about it, especially when we speak about this urgent need to move away from fossil fuel energy and all of the different problems that fossil fuels are presenting to communities, like poisoning air, right? So the air that people are breathing in is poisoned. It means that that air is polluted. It means that those people are going to have a lot of respiratory issues or a lot of breathing problems. Their lungs are going to be affected and that sort of thing. Environmental challenges are made significantly worse by climate change. It means they're worsened by climate change, which already we see that climate change is having a big impact on our continent as well as people's quality of life, and not just our continent, right? Across the global south or across the developing world. At the moment, we are seeing a cyclone. There's been a warning that's been issued for Cyclone Freddy that's coming for Mozambique, if it's not there already. And there've been efforts to like move people away from their settlements, and like these efforts to resettle them and move them from danger and put them somewhere else, right? So these are some of the challenges that are being made worse by climate change. In the past, we saw that cyclones did come, but at the moment, like where we currently are, these cyclones are coming at a much faster rate. It means that we're having more and more of those cyclones. I think in the past 5 years, I've probably heard of 3 and maybe more than 3 cyclones that have been affecting people so much. And if you look at the trends and if you look at the research, or if you look at just the data, and what people have been looking at over the years, you find that this is becoming worse and worse in recent times because of climate change. And obviously now people are being moved away from what they're used to and into different spaces. It's going to mean that their quality of life is changed and affected, and a lot of the times in a very negative way. So we tried to look at, or we were moving toward the fact that there is a link, right? There's a link between the energy rather, and the environment. We've spoken a little bit about energy, right? We know now that there are energy sources. We can see what energy is. And I'm just going to ask everybody to please be on mute. And if you'd like to contribute, to just put your hand up. So energy production and energy use have significant environmental impacts. I've been speaking a little bit about this so far, just with energy production, or the energy that we get from burning coal, and the significant environmental impact that has, not only on immediate communities, but on surrounding communities, and as a result on the rest of the country, the continent, and even the world. So some of these impacts include greenhouse gas emissions. It means that when we burn something, when we burn coal, greenhouse gases are released into our atmosphere, which burn a hole into our ozone layer, which means that the earth will not have that protective layer anymore, which means that we are going to experience rising temperatures. We hear a lot about this in the space, this idea of rising temperatures. A lot of people have even, been speaking about this idea of like needing to make sure that the global temperatures don't rise beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. What does that even mean, right? Why do people just say 1.5 degrees Celsius and leave it there? What it simply means in simple terms is that as the world gets hotter, different parts of the world are going to be impacted differently by this change in our atmosphere. It means that places that were normally hot are only going to get hotter. Places that were normally cold are only going to get colder. And at the same time, because of this heat, we're going to have like rising sea levels because the water is expanding. When you heat water, when you heat anything, it becomes a little bit bigger. And it sounds like it's such small changes, but a lot of the coastal settlements, people who live on the coast, people who live in the way or very close to the sea are going to be affected by these rising sea levels, because it's going to mean that things like tsunamis and like flooding and like that sort of things are going to affect them a lot more harshly than they would before. We also hear about, ice caps melting, which contributes to the rise in our sea levels, right? So these are some of the significant environmental impacts that we see due to all of these different problems that we have, right? So today we're not really looking at a lot of those problems. We're wanting to understand energy and the environment. That's why I'm not getting too much into specifics. So those impacts include greenhouse gas emissions, land use changes. So where we could farm, we can no longer farm because that land is no longer usable for that. So now we need to figure out what now we need to use the land for. Water consumption, where we would have had access to fresh water, maybe the water is contaminated, maybe the water is no longer fresh, maybe we just cannot access the water anymore. All of those are environmental impacts. So it's very important for us to get to a point where we can understand how we balance energy needs and environmental protection, because there's been this argument that, well, Africa needs a lot of energy. And a lot of the people who are making the case for non-renewables, or a lot of people who are still supporting this idea that we need to keep non-renewable energy sources on our grid, or we need to still depend on these non-renewable sources, are not always looking at the negative environmental impacts of us relying or staying reliant to these harmful or sometimes harmful energy sources. So a lot of these people we see that are putting profit, they want to benefit, because the reality is a lot of them get a lot of money from keeping things the way that they are. And unfortunately, they're not really talking to the need to protect people. They're putting profit over people. And we are already seeing the negative impacts of that. And this comes from, the very top to sometimes middle level, very low. And it's not everybody, but it's some people. And we need to get to a point where we can stress that it's not worth it to put profit to try and benefit and get money while other people suffer. So that's why it's important for us to get to a point where we can balance the energy needs with environmental protection. All right. So I know I've really just gone ahead and like sped through the whole thing. I do want to give us an opportunity now, if we have any questions, to just open up the floor before we get into maybe the second part of the session, just continuing to explore this idea between energy and the environment. All right, I see Gabriel's hand.
Thanks, Michelle. Before I kind of just see who else, maybe while everyone warms up to answer their question, I just want to say, firstly, thank you so much for that. I think it's been really great to kind of break into it a bit more. I mean, I'm quite versed in it, but it's like certain things just help with a good refresher at the end of this. I really do like that. Back to Basics can kind of just give you a good refresher and a reminder. I think mine is more of just a question around, you know, when it comes to, you know, renewable energy. I mean, I suppose this is quite a similar. I mean, maybe it's quite obvious, but we want that to be sustainably developed, correct? I mean, we wouldn't want renewable energies to be just as harmful as fossil fuels because of the way that we implement them. So obviously, it wouldn't be just as at all, but we do want our renewable energies to be sustainably developed, correct?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. I think when we do have this conversation around renewable energy, especially when we have the conversation, understanding the need for us to set up systems that allow us to transition from non-renewables to renewables, we want to still keep the justice aspect of it, right? So that's why we then call it the just energy transition. So it's not to say that we just urgently need to move away from non-renewables to renewables. We also need to do so in a way that still maintains people's dignity, that still prioritizes people's well-being, that still, makes sure that people are still important, really. So definitely, it's not just about moving, or it's not just about saying, oh, renewables. It's also about saying renewables in a way that is equitable, that is sustainable, that promotes equality and promotes justice in the way that we implement the transition, or even start reframing it in our minds. I do see a hand. Please forgive me when you do speak. Could you please also say your name for us? I do not want to say it in the wrong way.
Sure. Hi everyone. I'm Ram, based in Cape Town. So just to pick up on one of the last points you mentioned about this energy transition, the just energy transition. So one of my colleagues works with investors who want to fund social impact projects in Africa, and he was saying that Africa historically has contributed 1%, I don't know, less than that, to climate to greenhouse emissions, but more than 70-80% of the funding coming into Africa is going into green energy projects. So my question is, where do we balance the need for green energy transition versus some of the other priorities for African countries? Should we be asking investors to also spend money in some other priority areas as well? How important is the green energy transition in your opinion compared to relative to other challenges, I guess?
Cool. Thanks for that, Ram. I'm just going to hop onto it a little bit, and then I'm going to pass on to my colleague. So one of the problems that we see with some of what is being called climate finance is that it's not covering all of the climate impacted areas, right? So it is urgent that we focus on the just energy transition. So if we don't look at it just as a an energy conversation and really look at it from a social aspect, from a social improvement aspect, from the fact that with us transitioning, we still need to make sure that people have honorable and dignifiable jobs. We also need to make sure that as we phase away from being very dependent on the fossil fuel industry, we're also reskilling and upskilling people to be able to then participate into this green economy or into the just transition or where we would have transitioned to. That is still very, very important, right? So I think that with funds, we still need to realize that we still have some immediate issues that we have to deal with, issues like social ills, like the fact that people don't have access to education, like the fact that people don't have access to food, right? A lot of nations in and across Africa are food insecure or are on the verge of being food insecure. So funds, the just energy transition is very important, but there are other things that are as equally important. And so when we speak about the fullness of the just energy transition, we should not be looking at bits and pieces of the transition, especially in silos, right? That means that we're going to create more issues for ourselves because it's only going to be a few people who are going to transition from where we are to where we're trying to get to. And then the question becomes, where is the justice in that? We haven't really exhausted the answer to that. So I am going to tag Sarah in, and then Gabriel. Tracy, I see Sarah, I see your hand. We'll give you a chance in a moment. Sarah Farrow, please go ahead.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hello, everyone.
So I think sorry, Tracy, Sarah, I think there's confusion. I'll start Sarah Farrell and then Gabriel and then to you, Tracy, but it was confusing because we both Sarah. Sorry about that. So just on the question, I think that around funding, I think it's a really important point, and use one example of how funders have their own agendas, right? As you're saying. And I think it often speaks volumes in terms of where the funding is coming from, what is the agenda of where that funding is coming from, and what are their priorities. And so often the priority is behind backing big investment in green energy, and it is backing mitigation, so reducing the amount of fossil fuels that are going into the environment in order to ensure that European nations in the future, have a safer climate. But here in Africa, we're already facing that we are in need of climate adaptation. We're needing to adapt to the loss and damage that we're experiencing as a result of years of emissions, historical emissions from the US, from the global North nations. And so I think that just like you saw in COP with the loss and damage fund that was made, so that for those who don't know, there was a fund at COP that where grassroots civil society organizations really pushed for a long time to make sure that there would be funding put towards specifically the losses that are happening because of climate change, the damages that are happening, and the things that are not necessarily easy to recover from. That still needs to obviously happen properly, but my point is that happened as a result of pressure from civil society. And so I think your question around, do we need to be asking funders to consider social impact, is really important. And I think as organizations who receive funding, it's important to make funders aware of the realities on the ground in Africa and the need for things that are beyond just the energy transition and just energy, but around the just transition as a whole, including all of those other aspects of social good. Thanks. Gabriel?
Brilliant. Thanks, Sarah. I won't exhaust the question at all, and so I'll just mention just one thing. So I popped in the chat the breakthrough agreement from from COP27, and just to kind of highlight what Sarah said, that this has been something that island nations from beginning of climate devastation had been calling for, and only in recent years, as recently as last year, had the UNFCCC, other world leaders noted that this is a need because of the groundswell, but this has been something that beyond just civil society organizations, but just Pacific Island communities have been calling for decades. I think your point about it being something more than just one thing, it's an intersectional thing. You know, when we talk about climate justice, especially in a context of under-resourced areas, underrepresented areas, affected communities, we talk about justice, and we talk about the social, environmental, economic aspects of justice, not just it's not just about the environment, it's about people, it's about people's livelihoods, it's about people and planet together and their relationship together. So just highlighting that when we talk about just energy transition, it's only a small part of a broader transition that needs to take place, which is a just transition, an equitable transition from all current statuses of systems that we are under towards something that we need to work toward together. And so it's a just transition of land, a just transition of water, a just transition of knowledge, of more. And so when we talk about just energy transition only fits underneath just transition as a whole. It's only one aspect of it, and there's much more to go. So definitely, I agree that there needs to be a lot more discretionary funds, so that money that's not only targeted toward bringing online renewable energy, but reskilling, upskilling, building community capacity, so that as we move forward in this transition, that communities, that youth, that we can move with the changing time as well. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you so much for that question. It is amazing. I'll put a definition of discretionary funds in the chat in the Back to Basics workshops. We don't believe in using big words. And sometimes when we mess up, we try to explain them. So I'll pop them in the chat.
Thanks, Gabriel, Sarah, for contributing to that. And thank you, Ram, again for asking the question. Tracy, I am asking you to please unmute.
Hello, everyone. My question is on one of the slides of environmental challenges. You said that this climate change is worsening these environmental challenges. I thought that it's these environmental challenges like deforestation, they are the ones worsening the climate change. I would like more explanation on that, because I didn't get it. I thought it's the challenges worsening climate change, not climate change worsening them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just to make sure that I got you correctly there, you felt, or you think that deforestation and other such challenges are the ones that are making climate change worse. Am I right?
Yes.
So you're right. And so forgive me if I start to stutter. That's what the Back to Basics workshops are for. So looking at deforestation, right? Maybe just looking at deforestation as an example. The more that we cut down the trees, for whatever reason we do, so we just take away all of our forests, it means that we no longer have what we call carbon sinks. So carbon sinks are areas in the world that are able to trap carbon so that it doesn't escape into our atmosphere and burn a hole through the ozone layer, and therefore making things worse, and therefore making climate change worse, right? So you are 100% correct in that some of these challenges do worsen climate change, and others are also worsened by climate change, like soil degradation is also worsened by climate change, in that, so if we have a flood, right, say as a result of climate change, we have a flood in a particular area, and it washes away things, it washes away crops, it does damage. It means that we are going to have soil that is degraded. We'll find a description in the chat. Thank you for that, Gabriel. It means that as a result of climate change, or as a result of the impact that climate change had in that environment, the soil is going to be degraded. So it can also be used interchangeably. So what you're saying is 100% correct. And it can also be the other way around. The challenges can also be worsened by climate change. And some of these challenges can also worsen climate change, like deforestation. Awesome stuff. I see there are some contributions in the chat. Lynn Marjorie says non-cooperative, as in not hear out the suggestions of the people who are experiencing the problems surrounding energy resources. Can I assume that that's also where we were speaking about some of the challenges? I just wanting to make sure that I got you correctly there. I also saw a hand, and then I didn't see the hand anymore. Can I please ask? I think it was
Lindelani.
Yes. Lindelani, I'm going to give you an opportunity now. I just want to read Sadie's contribution. Related to the previous question, this one was about the funding question. So the question that we got from Ram. Related to that question, a relevant fact to share is that according to the 2022 IPCC report, Africa contributes roughly around 9% of global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. And the IPCC is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So if we're looking at it from a global perspective, we also see that even in that space, Africa still contributes significantly less. Thank you for those contributions. Lindelani, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm Lindelani from Eastern Cape, South Africa. I think the other thing that it can work to fight against climate change, it's an plowing, it's an agroecology and permaculture system. So in our schools, more especially in primary schools, so we as a youth, we need to visit that schools and make them to unlearn or forget about the European style of learning, then focus on the things that will affect us. And we need a style, or I don't know how can I talk it, but we need a plan to come out or to become free from the Western ideology, because we have almost everything here in Africa, but we don't know how to use them. We only focus on the European things. For example, last year there was a war between Russia and Ukraine, and the prices of the fertilizers were higher. So the people were desperate, and the others, they were stressed about the fertilizer, which is a chemical that will affect us and our lives. So while we have the crop manure and the grass for mulching, so we need to put this information, more especially in the youth. Even our grandparents, they know how to protect the environment from the climate. So before the years, maybe before maybe 10 years back, there were no bad things like this, like these days, because we are experiencing heavy rains and high rises, big winds, all that stuff. So we need a style. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda Lani, for that. And you're absolutely right. When we start having these conversations, especially when we have more of the in-depth conversations, we are wanting to explore, or we try to explore as much as we can, these concepts around decolonizing and decentralizing, and really going back to some of the practices that have conserved our environment. And really looking at Afrocentric ways to implement climate solutions. So you are 100% correct on that. I saw another hand. What I'm going to do, just for the sake of time, I'm going to just pause the Q&A in this here, so that we can continue a little bit, and then we'll come back to the Q&A again toward the end. But yeah, just continuing on from what you were saying, Linda Lani, about us needing to really prioritize indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices, centering the African experience so that we can better be equipped to deal with such issues that are affecting those who are in Africa, means that we also need to start looking away from some of the solutions that have been developed by the West, because we have seen that they're not aligning with what's on the ground, and people need to be capacitated. And in some cases, people have the capacity to develop these solutions for themselves and their communities, and they just need to be supported in that space. So definitely agree with what you were saying there. And then we are just going to swiftly move on a little bit and sort of continue. I don't suppose I think we can all see my screen. I'll assume that's a yes.
Yes, we can. Go for it.
Perfect. So now, where we ended off was energy and the environment. We looked a little bit about energy production and the environmental impacts, and why it's important for us to be in a space where we balance energy with environmental protection. And then this conversation around renewable energy also came up, and I got really excited because I was like, that is the next slide on renewable energy. So renewable energy sources, like we've mentioned, solar, wind, and hydropower. This simply means that these sources can be regenerative. And here's an example. We will never run out of the sun, right? We're always going to have the sun available to us. Maybe less so in the colder months, and in the winter we have a little bit less sun, but we'll never be in a position where we are completely without sun. In the same way that if we look at coal as an energy source, we burn coal and then it's gone forever, right? So that's the idea and the difference between renewable sources and non-renewable sources. Oil is another one. Once it's used, it's gone. But it leaves behind irreparable damage, and some damage that we're still trying to reverse, that a lot of researchers and people really look into this don't necessarily think that we're ever going to be able to reverse, and we can only try. So renewable energy sources like solar, or energy that we get from the sun, wind and hydropower, power or energy that we get from the water, have the potential to provide sustainable and affordable energy to Africa, while at the same time reducing environmental impacts. So we see that at this point in time, specifically, it makes a lot of sense for the world really to start the move, or what we call the transition, toward renewables, because it is said to be a lot more affordable, as opposed to where we currently are, where we are barely affording electricity because it's just that expensive. And while we can't afford electricity, it is still, or while we can't afford this energy, at the same time, it is having all of these negative impacts, not only on our environment, but negative social impacts as well. People's health is threatened, people's quality of life is threatened, people's lives are threatened simply because of these unsustainable and very expensive energy sources that we have at our disposal at the moment. This doesn't mean that renewable energy comes without issues or without challenges, rather. It comes with its own set of challenges, such as what we just now got into earlier with the conversation around financing, right? What does financing for a just energy transition even look like? There's a new fund that was just put in, the Fund for Loss and Damage, and this is one of the conversations that were had at COP. What does this look like from a practical perspective, right? There's also this idea of like policy. So policymakers or the law, what is the law that can actually facilitate the transition to us relying on renewable energy? Are we in spaces where our countries are saying it's absolutely imperative that by the year, I don't know, 2050, more than 50% of our electricity or energy comes from renewable sources? Is that something that is put in a policy and that countries are mandated or are having to follow, as well as regulatory frameworks? In South Africa, we have something that's called the JETP that Gabriel is very well versed on, and that is the Just Energy Transition Partnership. Am I right, Gabriel?
It
and
used
that
to be,
is
and it shifted. It's now the plan.
it's now the
But
plan.
we'll hope and pray that we figure it out. There will be an advocacy education workshop about it later on this year. So I won't plug that now, but we shall go for it.
Cool, thank you. So please keep an eye out for that so that we can understand some of these frameworks and what they mean, right? What is a regulatory framework? What does it mean in future Back to Basics workshops? These are some of the things that we're wanting to look at and we're wanting to understand. And one of the issues as well is technology transfer, right? Like what does this look like? What can we repurpose some of the non-renewable power plants into these renewable power plants? Like, is that something that's an option? These are just, questions that I have no answers to, questions that we haven't really seen people, get into and talk about. But these are some of the questions that we need to be having, especially when we start having this renewable energy transition. We also know that when it comes to renewable energy, it is so much faster to set up as opposed to non-renewable sources. And we have excellent examples of what that looks like in South Africa, where I am based, where we've seen that some power stations have taken more than 2 years to be built, whereas there's evidence that suggests that if we were to start investing in renewable energy sources like solar, for instance, we would be able to lay down a lot of the technology within 12 months and then have the renewable energy or like the solar power, maybe from a solar farm, online in about 18 months or something. So renewable energy really is an alternative. And when we look at it and when we think about it as an alternative, we should always remember that it also comes with its own set of challenges. Then we look at energy efficiency, right? The need to improve energy efficiency so that we can reduce energy demand, which means, so the idea of reducing energy demands not only means that everybody has access, or as many people have access to energy, but it also means that people are able to use energy in a way that is efficient. So in a way that is not wasteful, in a way that we understand that there's an abundance of it, hopefully when we move to renewable energy. But at the same time, we need to reduce the energy demand or the way that we use it so that we can sort of preserve and conserve it, save costs, as well as lessen the environmental impacts. which can be achieved through various measures like building energy codes, appliance and equipment standards, and energy management systems. That last sentence simply saying that people need to put a lot more effort in making sure that energy efficiency is a goal when we start looking at energy, especially in the developing world, where it's not everybody who has access to energy. Whereas we are wanting to have everybody to have access to energy. Gabriel, I see your hand.
Thanks, Michelle. And I just wanted to just add to that point. When it comes to energy efficiency, I mean, there's something called, right now in South Africa, we're in an energy crisis. And there's a very big difference between energy crisis and a capacity crisis. And so, for example, we have an energy shortage here in South Africa. So even if we had all the storage ability, like batteries or pump stations, we wouldn't be able to bring those pump stations and those batteries on, we wouldn't be able to charge them up because there's not enough energy to charge them up. And so right now we are in an energy crisis, we are in an energy crisis in South Africa. We have a capacity issue, we have an energy issue. And when it comes to renewable energy, it's not just something like coal, there's not just something like oil, it's not just something like gas that are all, firstly, not good for the environment, but also are things that are exploited and are used. It doesn't really create, it gets consumed. And so we consume those fossil fuels rather than, creating energy, rather than, if you're following what I'm saying. And so a big thing when it comes to renewable energy is it won't just be cool, that's coal, cool, that's gas, cool, that's oil. There's an energy mix when we talk about renewable energy. So it's like people will say, oh, but what about when the sun doesn't shine? Well, the wind will blow. What about when the wind won't blow, when the sun will shine? And what about nothing happens? Cool. Then we have storage capacity for that. So I think it's just important to note when we talk about energy crisis in any context, is that you can have an energy crisis with fossil fuels. And yes, we can still have it with renewable energy if we don't properly set up capacity, which basically is like storage facilities for that excess power. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you very much for that contribution. And I'm really not going to add much on that in an effort not to take away anything that you said. There's also this idea of diversifying energy. And one of the problems we're getting in South Africa specifically with this energy crisis is because our energy sources are not diversified enough to be able to support the needs of the country. And this might even be true in other African countries. So that is it from energy efficiency, and then energy access and poverty reduction. So we've spoken a little bit about energy access, right? I think this is a recurring theme. This is something that we keep sort of bringing up when we are speaking about energy. But access to modern energy services is very, very vital. It's very important for us to be able to be in a position where we can actually start reducing poverty, as well as support economic development, right? It means that through energy access, I think at the very beginning, I gave us a very small example of like, if a person does not have energy, it means that they cannot study. It means that at the end of the day, they cannot, they might not necessarily have the same opportunities to contribute to the economy. Therefore, they're not then part of economic development. Like in South Africa, there is a just about 40% youth unemployment rate, right? And this can be due to a lot of different reasons, but just this idea of not having access to energy services means that people are going to stay poor, and they're going to stay not able to contribute to economic functions, to economic activities. It means that the poor only get poorer. Energy access can improve health outcomes. It means that our health system will be able to maybe even support the demand, right? There is energy. our machines are working. It means that if I need an ultrasound, I can get an ultrasound and get out, so that the next person who needs an ultrasound will get an ultrasound. It means that if I need to be, I'm looking for another example for the healthcare system, and I just don't have it right now, but energy access simply means that health outcomes will be improved. So we will have access to healthier systems, not only within the healthcare system, but also at home, right? Earlier, we spoke about the lack of access to like clean cooking situations. It means because of energy access, and these are some of the things that we're going to learn a lot more in depth about when we have our dialogue on Wednesday. So that's why I'm also not going too much into depth. We're really going to understand the link between energy access and health outcomes. There's also going to be an increase in educational opportunities, right? I can give a very sort of loose example. Is at the moment there's a lot of rise in like self-help, like online courses. If you don't have energy, maybe you don't have electricity, it means your devices are not charged. It maybe even means you don't have those devices to be able to connect to the internet so that you can take this course, so that you can improve yourself, so that you can apply for that job and then get it, right? It means that with energy access, your chances become slightly better. So an increase in education opportunities, as well as enhanced productivity, as well as income. I think the last part I've just explained now, in terms of being able to access certain services, certain opportunities, just because you have energy, means that your income is likely going to be better, maybe even changed. You might even get opportunities to leave whatever country you're in search of better opportunities. So that's on energy access and poverty reduction. There is a direct correlation there. The more energy one can access, the better their chances to reduce poverty. And then policy and regulatory frameworks. We spoke a little bit about policy and regulatory frameworks here. But effective policy and regulatory frameworks are critical for promoting sustainable energy development and environmental protection in Africa, which includes measures such as energy sector reform. So really re-looking at what the energy sector looks like, and then moving it to align with where we want to be in terms of a just energy transition, in terms of an equitable society where everybody has access to resources, everybody has access to opportunities, renewable energy targets, as well as carbon pricing, right? There's something that's called carbon tax. It means when we start looking at big corporates, or any corporate really, they are fined for their carbon footprint if it moves to further away from like a threshold or whatever regulations they would have been given. So that's just like a little bit into this idea of like carbon pricing. It really is, again, like a concept on its own, and that's something that we're not going to necessarily get into 100% right now. But Gabriel was very kind to tell us what a carbon tax is. A carbon tax directly sets a price on carbon by defining a tax rate on greenhouse gas emissions, or more commonly on the carbon content of fossil fuels. Right. And so that's on policy and regulatory frameworks. We need our governments to get into a space where they are enforcing policy as well as setting up regulatory frameworks that can not only act to protect our environment, but can also act to enforce legislature or to enforce law, which means that there's going to be policing that happens, especially with corporates, organizations, whatever the case might be. This is going to be taken as something that is important. It's going to be pegged as a priority. So this is a need. Lynn says in the chat, introduction of new technological supplies that are affordable for every particular person in his or her own level of finance or incoming income, that are less dangerous. I think it can work. I love that contribution there. And then next we look at international cooperation. So when we started out, we spoke about this idea of like COP27. And if you're not necessarily familiar with what COP27 is, it's the conference of the parties. And the one that was held last year in Egypt in November was the 27th conference that was held, which is an international, which is a conference where a lot of international bodies, countries even attend, and then they have all of these discussions, negotiations happen, and then we are told what the future is from that point on. So international cooperation and partnerships are essential for addressing energy and environmental challenges in Africa, which includes technology transfer, financing, capacity building. We've spoken a little bit about technology transfer, a little bit about financing, not so much capacity building and knowledge sharing. So capacity building really in the form of other systems being set up in place where people are able to gain capacity or the skill to be able to participate not only in the conversations, but in the implementation of projects that maybe serve as solutions to the climate crisis, right? So these come through international cooperation, and sometimes what that looks like is through funding even. South Africa has a relationship with the European Union. So it means that the European Union can and often directs funding opportunities toward South Africa to assist in a lot of different program areas or areas of work, climate change being one, and other social ills, poverty, and other such things. So that's one form that international cooperation can look like. And these are all needs, so that when we have these discussions, especially at an international level, we're having a lot of the same conversation in that we can understand what we're saying to each other. In past times, we saw that a lot of the international conversations that we had, quote unquote, were not really international in that they were leaving out the developing world. So the developing world was just being looked at as a world that only receives, which is absolutely wrong, which is why now there's this conversation going around at the moment. We need for there to be systems set up that support our ability to implement our own solutions that we come up with. Because in as much as Africa has its own issues, if you look at it from a country to country perspective, the DRC does not have the same problems that Rwanda has, which doesn't have the same problems that Kenya has, which doesn't have the same problems that Zambia has, which doesn't have the same problems that Malawi has. So when looking at it like that, we then can have these conversations either state to state, country to country, but as well as from a international perspective. Yes. Cool. So then we come here to our second session of Q&As. I know that there were some people who wanted to have a chance to ask their questions. We are here now. If you have a question, a contribution, even a hand will be great. And maybe just before we get into that, a follow on to, capacity building, the idea of reskilling and upskilling, which is something that I briefly mentioned earlier. But when we start talking about this just energy transition and the transition away from coal, we're also looking at the industries that are most affected by our move away from fossil fuels. Like, how are we ensuring that we set up space and systems for workers in mines and the fossil fuel industry to be able to integrate seamlessly even, and be able to contribute in other sectors, especially when we start looking at once we've transitioned. But there's obviously a need for us to start setting up those spaces here and now, so that when we get to that spot and that time where we are needing to move away completely from the fossil fuel industry as our major energy source, those people are not just left, those people are also taken with when countries decide to move.
One moment, Michelle. I just want to encourage everybody to please mute their mics right now. I'm going to make sure that if you do speak, I'm going to just mute you just for a moment. If you would like to speak, please put the indication in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll happily allow you to once Michelle's done speaking. Thank you all. Back to you, Michelle.
Thanks for that. So it's really, really crucial that we create spaces when we have these conversations around energy and the environment. We're not just talking about like energy and like environment in a way that doesn't affect people. At the core of these conversations should be people, should be people's experiences, should be people's livelihoods, should be people's dignity. And so it would not be completely just for us to be having a just centered conversation without centering people. So that's something that I urge us to always remember when we have these conversations. Maybe we host our own dialogues, we host our own workshops. It's very important to center people, because at the core of all of the work that we do in the climate justice space, people should always be centered. And at this point, I'm just going to open up the floor for questions, contributions, if anybody has anything to say. Okay, I take
just remember that there's no such thing as a stupid question.
There's a request to talk a little bit more about carbon tax. What I can do, Ram, is I can ask you to take our details and then reach out to us, or give us your details and then we'll reach out to you. Simply because we end the session.
I can add a little bit to it.
Cool. I'll allow you to add a little bit to it. I just want to give Tracy a chance and then we'll come to you. Tracy, go ahead.
I'm not asking a question, I'm contributing to wise, like renewable sources of energy. Most people, Tracy, I'm from Uganda. Most people are not really informed about these renewable energies, even their advantages. They don't know how to extract energy, or even there are no different organizations apart from. So I think the most renewable energy side is hydro and solar, and even solar is mainly used in villages. I think the major reason why it's not vast, renewable energy is not vast this side, is because people lack the knowledge about it, even how it operates. That's what I wanted to add on.
Thank you so much for that contribution. Sorry, I muted myself by mistake there. Thank you so much for that contribution, Tracy. John, I see your hand.
Hello. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Joan. I'm from Kenya, and I'm so excited to be here. So I had I don't know if it's a question or a concern. It's in regards to the current climate crisis you're facing right now. Okay, I'm from Kenya, and it's been something that has been happening currently, the season from December last year, 2022, up to now. Both northern Kenya, Horn of Africa, and all around, whereby we're having a challenge in regards to the hotness and the warmness that is there, that it hasn't been experienced in the past years as the data says. And my question was, is this crisis consequence or an effect of the factors that we've talked about when you say deforestation, desertification, and all? And considering that we are saying Africa, we are only emitting 9% of the greenhouse emission, which is a third of what has been in the research or in the data. So is it really the factors that we've talked about, are they really the main cause of these effects of weather that we are facing, or is there any other factors or causes that are there that we don't know of? Thank you.
Thanks, John, for that question. So what we've covered is not the extensive version. It's not us going in depth and investigating all of the causes. So we only gave some of the examples that might be contributing to that. In most cases, it's a case-by-case situation, right? That means that some of the issues or some of the impacts that maybe South Africa faces and sees as results of climate change might not be the same causes that Kenya, for instance, has. So I think that would need us to go more in depth. That would need us to do a lot more research. But I can say that some of those are, it's only some, not all of them. But thank you for that question and telling us about some of what you're experiencing. Gabriel, you wanted to speak a little bit more about tax, carbon tax.
Take like 30 seconds, Michelle.
Sure.
Just jumping into it, just so people know a little bit more about carbon tax. So it's a very interesting topic. It is quite complicated though, but the beauty is that it doesn't have to be. And we'd love to kind of break down some of these things this year through some infographics and some knowledge products on our social media and on our website. So feel free to follow the links I've popped into the chat. And so basically a carbon tax, there's a saying, pay as you pollute. And unfortunately, you can put a tax on something in hopes that people won't pollute as much or won't push as much, or kind of basically use products that would have that tax on it. But unfortunately, a problem is that if you've got the money, you don't really care about the tax. It means nothing to you. And so big thing right now is, as people are defining what a carbon tax actually could look like, they're also defining other ways other than just, if you pollute, you have to pay, because big industries, they can afford to pollute, so they will just pay the fine regardless. So I think it's up to us as civil society, us as young people, communities, to come together and also just have that be noted to our world leaders and decision makers, that we don't want it just to be if they pollute, they must pay through a tax situation. There should be harder legislation, so bigger laws and acts in place that don't just allow rich people, rich organizations, corporations to just pollute and pay us off.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. And yeah, we have come to that point in the workshop that I dread the most, and it's having to say goodbye. But I refuse to say goodbye just yet. One thing that I'm going to say is thank you so much to everybody who's contributed. Thank you to all of the questions. Thank you to all of the comments in the chat. I did see a lot of them. And thank you for just being really awesome, for taking time out of your day to listen to us, to engage with us. One thing that we always need to remember is that when we do the work that we do in the spaces that we occupy, it could be in the social justice space, it could be in the environmental justice space, it could be in the social environmental justice space. We always need to remember that our work, this work of fighting for justice, needs us to actively work toward dismantling harmful practices, to constantly put in work to decolonize the spaces we exist in and work toward transitioning to a just and equitable future. When we do have these conversations, that is something that we need to make sure that it's front and center. The fact that we are centering people and we're moving away from a lot of harmful practices that have got us to the point that we are now. So thank you so much for every single person who's now come and attended. Thank you so much for your contributions. I see the chat is going crazy. Oh, I can see the chat is going crazy right now. And I'm tempted to go, we need 10 more minutes, but unfortunately that's just not how things are. So thank you so much to everybody who's contributed. I am going to leave some time for Gabriel to just talk us through some of the admin again, in case we forgot, especially when it comes to data reimbursements and other such things. But before I do that, just a kind reminder that on Wednesday, the 1st of March, same time, 5:30 p.m. CAT, Central African Time, we are going to have a Back2Basics dialogue. And in the dialogue, we are going to be speaking with some experts on our panel, talking to us about their experiences, their knowledge, sharing their knowledge, really putting into context what we've just spoken about today and some of what we've just found out today. So that's going to be very, very excited. Please reach out to us, send us an email, ask us questions if you have any. Until then, thank you. Gabriel, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle. I just want to say once again, thank you, everybody. I'll turn my camera on for a moment. Thank you, everybody, so much for attending today. We are truly, truly grateful. And a big thank you to Michelle for holding the space in such amazing ways as usual. Here comes a bit of the boring part, but it's also very important, is just to note with the data reimbursement side of it all. And so at African Climate Alliance, like I said in the beginning, we offer a small data reimbursement to support you for the time that you've made and the efforts that you've put forward to be here today. Unfortunately, because of such limited data or resources rather, only certain amount of people can be reimbursed data at a time, which means that we have a rotation system. So beginning of this year, we had a workshop where some people had access to the data reimbursement because it was a first come, first serve. So what will happen this time is, as we do data for this workshop and for the next workshop, we'll take into account who didn't receive data but was participating and attending the last workshop. I'll pop into the chat the data reimbursement form for anyone who's missed it. And just a reminder that if you don't get a response, posting on social media doesn't help. Emailing us helps. And so you can email us at team@africanclimatealliance.org. I'll pop that in the chat as well. And we genuinely would sooner help you. And it's a lot easier to help you when we do see your emails. And so I'm popping in the chat, there we go. The reimbursement form, be sure to put your country, your country code, make sure that you put what network you are for your data reimbursement. If you do not apply for data within 2 days of this attendance of this workshop, you will not be eligible for data, as well as the fact, just noting once again, we have limited supply, so it is on a first come, first served basis. We are truly grateful for your attendance. Michelle, I pass to you for the last words.
Please join us on the 1st of March at the same time, 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. Central African Time for our ACA dialogue, where we're going to be exploring the practicality of the just energy transition, the energy discussion in Africa. We hope to see you there.